Apart from its green coastal fringes, there's an awful lot of Australia that's rock, sand and harsh desert. And the men who pioneered the exploration of this interior were unified not so much by their heroism, their prowess, or even by their navigational skills, as by the fact that there was a little bit of virtually all of them that was completely barking mad. I've embarked on a journey across space and time. We're going to try and recreate that moment. Australia started as a social experiment. Convicts, can you mount the gangplank, please? So I'm looking for clues to explain what made this eclectic and sometimes eccentric nation what it is today. That is the real ancient and magical story of Australia. In this chapter, I'm searching for the promised land. Me and a generation of nutty explorers who blazed a trail in the grab for land. The first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man.
They said the bushrangers are coming.
It just looked absolutely terrifying.
It would have been horrible.
It was a time of enterprise. Headlines created by finds like this brought diggers here from all over the world. And if Australia was to stake its claim, justice had to be done. We must redress the grievances inflicted on us. One way or another. Society was transformed. In the middle of the 18th century, exploration of Australia's vast interior was all the go. Explorers were heroic figures, the astronauts of their age. A lot of the brave explorers who crisscrossed this vast land are now justifiably famous here in Australia. But there's one man who opened up huge tracts of South Australia, including what's now its most successful wine-growing area. But that's not what made him famous at all. He's celebrated for something entirely different. He was the first man in history to be shot by his own camel. John Horrocks arrived in Australia on his 21st birthday, carrying a burning desire to make his mark on the colony. The young gent made a good fist of farming, but soon decided exploring was more to his nature. For that purpose, he imported Harry, the very first camel to arrive in Australia. Now, I know a lot of camels are really sweet-tempered, but Harry was a bit of a monster. The first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man called Garlic, and there were two huge gashes in Garlic's forehead and one down his cheek. Then Harry bit one of the goats, shook him by the scruff of its neck and apparently tried to eat it, and then finally he took a bite out of the flour bag. And of course that caused a great big trail of white all the way behind them and used up a lot of valuable supplies. Now, all that might sound like a bit of comedy, but then things got much darker. Horrocks, up ahead, saw a sweet little bird and thought, oh, this is going to look great for my stuffed bird collection. So he went to get his gun, and at that moment, Harry lurched or something, and the gun went off, and it went right through Horrocks' hand, knocking off all his right fingers, then through his cheek, and knocked all his teeth out. When he was shot, young Horrocks was just 3 days into his grand adventure. A week after that, he dictated what would be his final recorded words. They read, "It is with the greatest regret I have to inform the committee and my fellow colonists who subscribed towards the expenses of the expedition of its untimely and unfortunate termination." A very polite, dare I say typically British way of saying, I've been shot, so the trip's off. Horrocks contracted gangrene and died 23 days later. But before he passed away, he ordered that the camels should be shot. It took 2 bullets to kill Harry, and only after he'd managed to take one final bite out of a stockman's head. The vast interior of Australia was still a mystery when Horrocks' luck ran out. In fact, no European laid eyes on the red centre of Australia until more than 50 years after the British set up their little settlement in Sydney. The reason was these, the Blue Mountains. For decades, Sydney was landlocked. What lay beyond these rock escarpments was just speculation and guesswork. There was an insatiable demand for wool in the early 1800s. Anyone in the colony who could get wool to England's great textile mills was virtually guaranteed instant wealth. So the motivation to find more farming land was pretty strong. The mountains were finally crossed in 1813 by explorers who followed Aboriginal trails along the ridges. They were a hardy bunch, the early explorers, but some of them stood out. Thomas Mitchell arrived 15 years after the Blue Mountains were crossed. He believed all the good farming land had already been discovered. More than anything, he wanted to make his mark as an explorer and felt frustrated to be put on surveying duty. But ironically, it was his surveying skills that led him to finally achieve his goal. Apollo and I are going to give you a bit of a demonstration of surveying because Mitchell had this really curious way of working out how far he'd travelled during the course of the day. And he did it using these things, broad beans. He'd stick them in his pocket and then he'd count the steps that his horse made, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, till he got to 100. When he got to 100, he put a bean into his pocket, then he'd start again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, until he got to another 100, pop another bean into his pocket. And he reckoned that his horse took 950 steps to go 1 mile. So at the end of the day, if he'd got 100 beans in his pocket, then he knew that his horse had travelled about 10.5 miles. Now, that may not be as accurate as GPS, but quite frankly, Mitchell is the most famous surveyor in Australia, so who am I to argue? Who are you to argue, either? Have some more beans. Doesn't want any more beans.
Mitchell was asked to use his surveying skills to chart the Darling River in the west of New South Wales. But his ambition got the better of him. He saw there was much more promising land to the south of the Murray River and decided to set off into uncharted territory. And he hit the jackpot, open pasture land as far as the eye could see. He called it Australia Felix, lucky Australia. And it was lucky for him, too. As one of the very few explorers to discover rich pasture land, Mitchell's place in Australian history was assured.
Mitchell and his team had crossed mountains, navigated rivers and slept rough in the bush. By the time they got to Portland on the south coast of Victoria, they'd been on the move for 5 months. They were miles away from civilization in previously uncharted territory. Except, actually, they weren't.
Imagine Mitchell's surprise. He'd stumbled onto an established settlement that no one else in the colony knew existed. A farming family from West Sussex called the Hentys had slipped through the back door with a land grant from the King of England.
Tony, hi, come on in.
Thank you. How long had the Hentys been in Australia?
They'd been in Portland for 18 months before Major Mitchell arrived. So they had their huts built and their veggie garden and their trees and they had a very good establishment. They had their cattle, they had their horses, they had a lot of stock over here.
So what happened when Mitchell showed up at the Hentys' place?
Well, they thought they were bushrangers because they didn't know there was no white men for miles around.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden this white man was coming through the bush at them you know, with guns and feathers in their caps and all sorts of things, and they went, well, you know, this must be a bushranger, so we'll load the gun.
Could it have been one of these old guns?
Yeah, well, this gun here is Francis Henty shotgun. So that's dated around about 1810. It's the first shotgun in Victoria. Edward Henty, in his recollection of the meeting, actually says that the old gun was loaded to the breech to make sure he gave the bushrangers a warm reception.
So the meeting is on record?
Yes, it is. This is a document written by Edward Henty, and what he goes on to say is that the appearance of Major Mitchell and his band of 5, with emu feathers in their caps, as well as the red tail feathers of the black cockatoo, blue and red serge shirts, and much tattered, patched and worn, and certainly very fierce and formidable looking.
They'd have looked absolutely terrifying,
That would have
they?
been horrible. An explanation and reconciliation followed. So that's when they went, oh, well, we won't shoot him yet, we'll find out what he's about. Mitchell arrived without anything, because they'd run out of flour and all those sorts of things, so the Henty said, well, we've got a supply ship turning up in a day, we'll wait until that comes, and then we can load you up. So
yeah.
They gave them flour and gin and whole heaps of grog and stuff, so they sent them off their way after about 3 or 4 days.
Now, Major Mitchell must have been grateful because he tipped off the Hentys about the fertile lands that he'd found to the north, and that helped make them rich. But when he got back to Sydney, he reported the presence of the squatter clan to his boss, the new Governor of New South Wales, and it didn't do well for the Hentys.
So what did Governor Gibbs do?
Well, he set down a team, because he went right off the rocker, apparently. He went, oh, what's everybody, what are they doing down
Big
there?
landowners in my land.
What's happening?
Yeah.
That damn king, what's he doing? I'm trying to run this show. So he set down a surveyor and stuff. And, of course, the Hentys had laid out their houses and their gardens and everything else. And just to really make the point to the Hentys, right, that Gibbs was actually the boss,
Yeah.
they actually put a road right through Edward Henty's middle of his house.
You know what?
Which was very nice.
I think the Hentys would have been much better off if they'd shot Mitchell.
They were very British at that stage.
Actually, you're a Henty, aren't you? I think I'll just put that down and move to the other side of the room. When I first heard the story about Mitchell meeting the Henty brothers, I assumed that the Hentys were a pair of ragamuffins trading with whalers and making a hand-to-mouth living. I now realise that they were landowners, they were favoured by the King of England, and were very, very respectable. Look, this is Francis Henty's own top hat. I better give it back before I go.
Thousands of hopeful squatters followed pioneers like the Hentys whenever news of new pasture lands reached Sydney. Usually with nothing more than a few head of sheep and a plan to get rich quick. They were rapidly spreading out across the country, each new run a few kilometres further into the interior than the last. By the end of the 1840s, sheep runs covered much of eastern Australia. But of course the land wasn't vacant. Some Aborigines accepted the squatters, but there were others who resented their arrival and decided to fight back. As the sheep moved out across the country, so did the violence. In places like Tasmania, there was armed resistance. Aborigines, angered by the takeover of their lands, waged a kind of guerrilla war. Retaliation from the squatters was often brutal and excessive.
This little painted board is really rare, which is why I'm wearing the white gloves. And it's a proclamation from a Lieutenant Governor in Tasmania in the early 19th century, and it's addressed to the Aboriginals. That's why there's this little hole here, so that it can be tied to trees out in the bush. And it's like a cartoon. In the top frame, you've got black people and white people together living in perfect harmony, like in the song by Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder. Two little children there holding hands. You've got a black baby there and a white baby there. Maybe it's even implying into marriage, I don't know. And then in the frame below, you've got the top brass of both the Aboriginals and the colonists shaking hands. But then, in the next frame, you can see that if a black person kills a white person, then the black gets hung, and likewise, if a white person kills a black person, then the white person gets hung, which all seems pretty fair and dandy, except it's not really a very good representation of the truth.
In fact, no white person was hanged anywhere in Australia for killing a black person in the first 50 years of the colony, despite the fact that thousands of Aboriginals were murdered in those years.
On June the 10th, 1838, a posse of white men rode into Mile Creek Cattle Station, saying that they were looking for some Aboriginals who'd been rustling cattle. Now, there were Aboriginals on that station, but they were known to be mild and inoffensive. They clearly hadn't had anything to do with any cattle theft. Nevertheless, the posse rounded them up.
These men were mostly ex-convicts employed as stockmen in this remote part of northwestern New South Wales. No doubt they thought they could get away with the massacre because some of them had been involved in wholesale murder of Aboriginals before and hadn't been brought to justice.
The posse had tied up all 28 Aboriginals into a kind of human ball, 28 terrified men, women and children, and then they dragged them out into the countryside and wandered round with them for about an hour in a pretty ineffectual way, as though they didn't really know what they were going to do next. But then they must have had some kind of change of heart, because all 28 Aboriginals were murdered. Terrible things were done to them. Most of the children were decapitated. The adults were hacked to death and burned. Then the posse rode back to Mile Creek, had their breakfast, and boasted about what they've done.
Eventually, the men were rounded up and charged with murder. But arresting them was one thing. Convicting them would be the real test of justice.
When the Mile Creek massacre came to trial, the judge reminded the jury that there was no difference in law between killing a white man and killing a black man. Nevertheless, it took the jury just 20 minutes to find all 11 defendants not guilty, at which point cheers broke out in the courtroom. The mood of the times was that no white man should be hung for killing a black man.
But times were about to change. Governor Gibbs took the unprecedented step of ordering a second trial. This time around, justice was served. 7 of the 11 accused were hanged for murder. It may not have been the last massacre of Aboriginal people in Australia, but the trial was a turning point for the treatment of Aboriginal people under British law. It's a subject that's close to the heart of historian Eric Wilmot.
What do you think the significance of the Mile Creek judgment was?
The significance was it represented a complete change in the attitude of Europeans, the colonisers, to the Indigenous people of Australia.
So as far as you're concerned, the verdict and the way the verdict was implemented were a huge change in Australian history.
Yeah, the first change was that these people were human. And if you killed them, you could be charged with murder, which is what happened. And be executed for it. That was fantastically important.
The Aboriginals who worked at Mile Creek were pretty easygoing. They wouldn't have been part of the cattle rustlers. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that is true. But I mean, at that stage, everyone did a bit of cattle rustling. Keep in mind, most of the people that worked on Mile Creek Station and the stations surrounding there were ex-convicts. Being offered a decent job as a stockman was pretty good. One of the things that they became convinced with that stood in the way of this new life of theirs was the existence of Aboriginal people who insisted this was their land.
It's an issue that's been faced by Indigenous people the world over. Occupiers arriving seeking new lands and profits, slowly and surely decimating the culture that preceded them. I like historian Geoffrey Blaney's line. Across the world, many families sleeping each night beneath blankets of Australian wool didn't know the bloodshed which had accompanied the raising of part of that wool.
Then, in the middle of the 19th century, something was discovered in the land that had a profound effect on Aboriginal European relations and transformed this country and cities like this one virtually overnight. That discovery was gold.
Every Australian school kid knows the discovery of gold in 1851 transformed Australia. But actually, it was kept a secret for decades. Convicts cutting a road near Bathurst were rumoured to have struck gold as early as 1814.
So why weren't they shouting about it from the hills? Well, there was a bit of self-interest going on here on the part of the farmers and landowners whose interests were so strongly represented in government. They reckoned that if they announced the discovery of gold, then all their workers and the convicts would run off and start looking for it, which makes a lot of sense. Except when the gold rush was announced in California, loads of them ran off anyway to America.
California was soon overrun by hundreds of thousands of prospectors from all over the world. The Englishman Edward Hargreaves was among those who tried his luck, and like so many others, left with nothing to show except a tan. But in 1851, back in New South Wales, his luck changed.
There wasn't very much, not even enough to fill a tooth, but Hargreaves knew that gold, like gold prospectors, was never found on its own. This was a momentous discovery, and the story goes that when he made it, he jumped to his feet, turned to his prospecting partner, John Lister, and said, "This is a historic day for New South Wales. I'll be made a baronet, you'll be made a knight, and my horse will be stuffed, put in a glass case and sent to the British Museum."
Well, none of those things actually happened, but Hargreaves knew how to talk up a story. He even talked the New South Wales government into awarding him £10,000 for his discovery. And in May 1851, the Colonial Secretary of New South Wales announced that gold had been discovered near the town of Bathurst. For the new colony of Victoria, this was a disaster. Almost overnight, the streets of the capital city, Melbourne, were deserted. Ships laid idle at anchor. The New South Wales gold rush threatened the very existence of the new colony. If the discovery of gold was the stimulus package New South Wales needed to prosper, it had the opposite effect on the other colonies. The mass exodus to the goldfields in the north was depleting the population of Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Victoria countered with a reward of its own for the first person to find a commercial quantity of gold. Ironically, gold had been discovered the year before in central Victoria, but the farmer wanted to keep it quiet because he didn't want his sheep disturbed. The 200 quid reward changed his tune and triggered a gold rush that would soon dwarf the one in New South Wales. Central Victoria would prove to be the richest alluvial goldfield the world had ever known. Nuggets the size of house bricks were being found. Tons of gold were being extracted. There was fever in the air.
I'll show you what the fuss was all about. In here is the welcome nugget. It weighs an extraordinary 69.9 kilos, and at today's prices, it's worth 3 million Australian dollars. It was found by a Cornishman called Richard Jeffrey, and it was the headlines created by finds like this that brought diggers here from all over the world. This isn't the original, by the way, it's a replica. The original was melted down and turned into sovereigns.
In 2 years, Victoria's population grew from 70,000 to more than 500,000. 1 in every 50 people in Britain migrated to the colonies. Overnight, there was a new class of new Australians, not convicts, but free thinkers and dreamers who came flooding in from all corners of the globe.
They were intelligent, educated, idealistic, and incredibly diverse. There were diggers from Italy, Germany, China, America, Canada, Ireland. Some of them had fought wars in their own homeland, others had been expelled for their political activities, but ironically, they all thought that the convict colony could offer them freedom and the sniff of wealth.
For some, striking it lucky remained just a dream, while others dug up wealth beyond their wildest imaginations. Free from the strictures of class and parish back in Europe, the diggers who hit pay dirt could live like kings. Some only for a day, but kings nonetheless.
The goldfields became a place of extravagance and excess. There was one miner who bought all the champagne in a Melbourne hotel and tipped it in a horse trough so that everyone could have a slurp at it. And there was another one who trotted around on his horse, literally in golden horseshoes. Society was transformed.
With all the money that was being thrown around, it's hardly surprising that sex and scandal soon followed. Scandal arrived in 1855. Her name was Lola, and yes, she was a showgirl. Lola Montez promoted herself as an exotic Spanish dancer, except Lola wasn't Spanish, Lola wasn't even Lola. She was plain Eliza Gilbert from the Irish county of Limerick. But she grew into the sort of girl that limericks are written about.
Lola was a bit of a gold digger too, and when she turned up in Ballarat, it must have been like Madonna was in town. She did this dance called the spider dance, where she had little bits of black material sewn on the various parts of her clothing, which she'd attempt to brush off during the dance. You can imagine how well that went down with the lads in Ballarat. And like all good celebrities, she punched a journalist when she was here. Well, she didn't actually punch him, she horsewhipped him in the bar of the United States Hotel.
Her tour of Australia received mixed reviews. The beautiful and notorious performer died just 5 years later, aged 42. What must it have been like to live here on the diggings? Thousands arriving every week, the cry of Eureka in the air. I've come at a good time. Every year, the good people of Chewton celebrate a famous event from those days. Among the happy throng is Goldfields historian Robin Annear.
So did many of them actually get rich quick?
Yes, I think they did. And a lot of them spent it just as quickly, you know, on gold nugget earrings and fast women.
What do you think that the new settlements that they were now living in would have been like?
Oh, the settlements here on the gold rushes were tents, lots of tents. There wasn't much room to walk between them. You and your dog could get through, probably. Nearly everybody had a dog lashed to their tent to protect the gold, usually hidden somewhere therein. There were settlements of 4 to 5 men usually to a tent, and they took turn at being the housewife for the week, which was not a task that was enviable because they all criticised one another's cooking. Somebody would have put out the biggest log they could chop down and roll to that spot, and that would be the neighbourhood lounge. If that was near your tent, you were very favoured. The neighbourhood would gather of an evening, and so the hills and valleys around here were just covered in huge bonfires. Every night the stars were out and they felt like the kings of the world.
But the party couldn't last forever. The government wasn't going to allow the majority of the population to live in tents on the goldfields. It was a double disaster. No labour in the city and on the farms, and no tax revenue. The diggers' licence fee was their solution, and it was deeply unpopular.
Why did they get so upset about the licences?
Well, it was a tax, and why wouldn't they? Often they wouldn't find gold first up, or wouldn't find gold, enough gold to be constantly covering the cost of flour, and which all their supplies were very expensive. So it could be hard to afford a gold licence. But the main problem was the way in which their gold licences were checked by the troopers, by the police, and by the gold inspectors. But this sort of behaviour of constantly being tapped on the shoulder by the troopers, who treated them in a very unfriendly and impolite fashion. There were little skirmishes where the police treated them in a more unruly fashion than they should have, burning tents down and so forth. But on the whole, they put up with it. But when we got to the point in December 1851, 3 or 4 months into the gold rushes, where the government, in order to impose control on the diggings and really make some of the diggers go back to their jobs and go back to working for the wealthy squatters, the government decided to double the cost of the gold licence, and that was just one step too far.
What happened? Tell me what happened.
Well, somebody put an advertisement up on the trees all around about the diggings here. Went up these notices: diggers, meet, gather, protest, and named a date, the 15th of December, in the place, the Shepherd's Hut, and all those thousands of diggers raised their voices as one.
It was an echo from the old country, where the English Chartists organised monster meetings in the 1840s in the struggle to give the working man a vote. In the wild frontier, the diggers wanted to be heard, while the government felt its grip on the colony was slipping. This monster meeting loomed as a mighty showdown between the immovable and the unstoppable.
We're diggers, united, we'll never be defeated.
It was the 15th of December 1851, and the word was out. Diggers were outraged at the doubling of the gold licence fee and at the intrusion on their liberty.
We'll never be defeated. I probably shouldn't say this here, but I do have a bit of sympathy with the authorities. After all, these thousands of people had just poured in to the colony, and there wasn't any infrastructure, there were no roads or anything like that, no law enforcement. It was pretty much chaos, so they did need some money. On the other hand, the gold diggers had probably spent their life savings getting here. When they got here, they had to pay for a licence. Now the licence was going to be doubled, and they'd have to carry it with them all the time. If they didn't, they were likely to be fined. You can see why things kicked off.
Hey, mate.
Hello, mate.
Many had come to the goldfields to break free from the shackles of the class system. Now they felt they were losing control of their own destiny and were determined to seize it back. On that hot summer day, more than 10,000 of them marched to a place called Shepherd's Hut. Jeff Hocking is a local historian who's written extensively on the monster meeting.
What happened when they all got here?
Well, they had speeches. People came and stood on a dray, just like we have here today, and they had rousing speeches saying to the government, we don't want to pay more taxes, we think it's unfair. After all, there was no infrastructure at all. There was nothing except police and tax gatherers, no roads, nothing was provided.
Will you pay the £3 licence? We're willing to pay a little, but skinned alive we will not be.
I think people were really saying we want to be free from the factory owners, from the squatters, from those people who make us chase sheep all day of our lives. This is an open land. We're free. We can make a new life for ourselves. It's not old England. And in a way, they were quite shocked to find the government turning up so soon with rifles and muskets and bayonets demanding money.
Will you submit to oppression and injustice? Meet, agitate, be unanimous.
So they kind of won because they stopped the taxes being increased. But in a way, this was just the prelude to 2 or 3 years of struggle.
It's really the spark. It was ignited here at the monster meeting in Chewton and really burst aflame in Eureka 3 years later. So we claim quite proudly that our first steps to democracy in this country started here at this spot.
All across the goldfields, diggers had the scent of victory in their nostrils. For the first time, the labouring classes felt they had the upper hand. The feeling wouldn't last.
The government saw the writing on the wall, so what did it do? It built a bigger wall in the shape of a massively increased police force. They brought in extra police from Tasmania, from the London Met. They recruited eager young gentlemen, and these coppers didn't mess around. This is the log that the diggers were chained to if they couldn't produce their licences. And a lot of the police didn't wear uniforms. They went undercover, infiltrating the diggers' groups. The goldfields were well on their way to becoming a police state.
The crackdown only hardened the resolve of the diggers, whose numbers continued to swell. By the end of 1854, the goldfields were at flashpoint.
After months of negotiating with the authorities, the diggers tried direct action by setting fire to their licences. The police responded with more licence checks and more arrests. The mood got ugly. The diggers got more and more militant.
At the centre of all this rabble-rousing was a man who'd once studied to be a Catholic priest. His name was Raffaello Carboni. He'd left his native Italy to escape what he called tyrannical rulers and the law of the sword. And he was outraged by the Victorian government's heavy-handed tactics.
He found himself on the goldfields agitating for revolt and reform, and he gave a speech which is very much like a speech that another famous man gave over 100 years later. And in it, he fantasised about what life in Victoria ought to be like and how the Victorians were now being thwarted. He said, "I have a dream, a happy dream. I dreamt that we had met here together to render thanks to our Father in heaven for a plentiful harvest, such that for the first time in this our adopted land, we have our own food for the year. But not so, Britons, not so. We must redress the grievances inflicted on us, not by crown heads, but by blockheads, aristocratical incapables who never did a day's work in their lives."
The diggers believed their grievances had been heard. But the next morning, the authorities continued the harassment. It was the last straw for the diggers of Ballarat. They started to build a stockade on the goldfield called Eureka, a barrier to the licence checkers.
When the inevitable showdown occurred, 800 diggers marched two abreast towards Eureka. It was a bit like that moment at the beginning of the Olympic Games where you get all those people from different nations marching round the stadium. You had the Canadian flag bearer with the Southern Cross, the Italian Carboni being urged on by the Irishman Peter Laylaw, telling everyone to grab every piece of metal or wooden shaft that they could in order to plunge it into the tyrant's heart. You've got French, Germans, Swedes, you got veterans from the American Revolution, all of them swept along on this tidal wave of emotion, determined to confront their oppressors and seize some kind of freedom for themselves.
Then, at dawn on Sunday the 3rd of December, when the stockade numbers were at their lowest, the troopers attacked. The killing was indiscriminate. Dozens lost their lives. It was said that some diggers were executed on the spot. Their leader, Peter Laylaw, was badly injured. his arm later amputated. The surviving leaders were arrested and charged with treason against Her Majesty Queen Victoria.
The prosecution had a pretty good case, didn't they?
Well, you would think so. I mean, it was obvious who were the rebels, and it was obvious the people in the dock were those who were within the stockade.
Who was the jury?
The jury was selected from Melbourne citizens, but they really worked very hard to make sure there were no Irishmen on the jury.
It really was an open and shut case against the rebels. The Crown produced witnesses, motives, all the evidence they'd need to send the diggers to the gallows. But when the jury retired, the most extraordinary thing happened. They returned a short time later to deliver the verdict, not guilty. One digger after another.
I think the problem was that they were all charged with treason.
Because the punishment was just so gruesome.
The punishment was extreme. I mean, it was still hung, drawn and quartered, which doesn't bear thinking about, really. And people just didn't want that sort of thing happening here on this goldfield, in this new colony, this new society that they were trying to build. And they weren't prepared to give the Crown that opportunity to do that.
Even Carboni got off, who was clearly guilty.
Carboni was obviously a bit of a nuisance, I think, and he was very intelligent, well-educated, and he was like a catalyst amongst all of the diggers because he could speak so many different languages. And a real revolutionary. After he was acquitted and subsequently became a mining warden in Ballarat, but left soon after and went back to Italy, and he fought with Garibaldi. So he was filled with that revolutionary fervour and pursued it back home.
Do you think it's fair to say that Eureka was the closest that Australia ever got to a revolution?
Oh, certainly. It's the only armed revolution where rifles were shot. They built a fort, they flew a flag, and they paraded like the military. I mean, they effectively became a military force.
The American writer Mark Twain summed it up pretty nicely. The Eureka Stockade is the finest thing in Australasian history. It was a revolution. Small in size, but great politically. It was a strike for liberty, a struggle for principle, a stand against injustice and oppression. It's another instance of a victory won by a lost battle. Soon after, the licence system was abolished, police numbers were cut dramatically, and political representation was extended to the miners. A new era was dawning, with new colonies such as South Australia, as well as old ones with new names like Tasmania, introducing legislative assemblies of ordinary citizens. Rule by governors was on the way out. Democracy was taking its place.
I reckon there's something rather unique about Australia. No revolution was required to get rid of its colonial masters, and no revolution was required to establish a new government. Yes, there was a bunch of pike-wielding seditionists who were accused of bearing arms, but what happened to them? They were freed, acquitted, and they ended up as businessmen and MPs. And this says something to me about the emerging Australian character of that time. First, you had a load of people challenging authority, and the next minute, they were the authority. And you know, I think there's still a bit of that happening around here, even today.
It's curious how quickly everyone moved on. Almost as though it had just been a football game or something. Victoria was now per capita one of the wealthiest places on Earth. Gold had transformed the young colony in a very short time. And now it wanted to flex its financial muscles. In the 70 years since colonisation, no one had crossed the continent from south to north. Many still believed that there was a great inland sea in the centre of Australia. So a group of prominent Victorians decided the first to do it would have to be one of their own. A pile of money was raised, and Robert O'Hara Burke, a country copper with no real bushcraft and poor leadership skills, was chosen to lead the cashed-up expedition. The man unfortunate enough to be his sidekick was William John Wills, whose father had amputated the arm of Peter Laylaw at the Eureka stockade. The ambitious explorers would soon enter folklore, for all the wrong reasons.
Thousands of Australians go up and down this road in Royal Park in Melbourne every day, but I bet hardly any of them know what this extraordinary edifice is. It really is quite bizarre, isn't it? It actually marks the spot where Burke and Wills set off on their famous expedition. 15,000 cheering people saw them go. One of their carts broke down before they'd even left the park, and they only managed to make 11 kilometres on that first day. But then Burke turned round and galloped all the way back to Melbourne because he'd become obsessed by this 17-year-old girl and wanted to ask her to marry him. Whether or not she agreed, history doesn't record.
What we do know is that he never laid eyes on her again. The year was 1860. Burke and Wills led their expedition of 18 men, 22 horses and 25 ships of the desert into the unknown interior. Burke was ill-equipped in many ways to lead such a massive excursion, but not under-equipped by any means.
The list of things that they took with them is really quite extraordinary. Pages and pages of the stuff, and such a lot of it. 6 tons of firewood, and very bizarre things like 16 pairs of blankets for Asiatics, 4 dozen assorted nipples, 12 dandruff brushes, 60 pounds of curled horsehair. I love this one. 6 kangaroo thongs, 4 dozen looking glasses for natives, and a Chinese gong. They certainly didn't die because they ran out of kit.
Burke and Wills made it as far as Menindee, a tiny outpost in far western New South Wales. It's here that Burke started to go a bit balmy. He became paranoid that others would beat him in the cross-continental dash. Burke raced ahead of the main group to Cooper's Creek, going further than any white explorer before him. But that wasn't enough. He pushed on with just 3 other men, intending to be the first to traverse the continent of Australia. Dave Phoenix takes up the story.
Well, Burke had asked the depot party to wait at the Cooper Creek for 3 months. He thought that he could go from the Cooper halfway across Australia and back in about 3 months. Wills had the maps. He was a little bit more conservative. He realised how far they had to go, and he'd asked the depot party to stay for 4 months. After 4 months, the depot party decided they were going to leave. It took Burke 4 months and a week, and they got back to the depot the day the depot party left.
That is terrible luck.
Yeah, absolutely terrible luck. They've walked across the continent, they've walked halfway back, and they're just 9 hours too late.
Burke and Wills had missed the last bus. Their supplies were all but gone.
How did they survive?
They went on half rations at first, and then they went on quarter rations. The local Aborigines gave them food. They gave them rats. There was a plague of rats, so they had fat rats baked in their skins. They had fish, and this seed here, this is an aquatic fern. It's called nardoo, like a 4-leaf clover. And once this stuff's died and dried out, it has a little seed, a sporocarp on the bottom, and this is what the seeds look like. And the Aborigines would grind this stuff into a flour, it makes a sort of yellow flour, and they would either then make it into a dough and cook it in the fire as a bread, as a damper, or they would add a lot of extra water and have it as a gruel or a porridge. It's got quite a bitter taste. It hasn't got a lot of protein in there. Let's have a taste. It's quite bitter.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Doesn't really taste of much.
But ironically, the Aborigines may well have killed them with kindness. Dave's theory is that it was the nardoo that finished them off.
There's a toxin thiaminase in there which wipes out vitamin B1 in the body. Because the Aborigines had it as part of a varied diet, it doesn't have any real problems. But because Burke and Wills were living on this stuff exclusively, it gave them a disease called beriberi, wiped out all the vitamin B1 in the body. Whether it killed them or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly accelerated the deaths. When he got to the stage where Wills could no longer continue, and they built him a little shelter, they gathered him some nardoo and some firewood and some water from the creek. His bones were almost through his skin and his elbows, and then he realised he was close to death, and unless something turned up, he would die. And then Burke also couldn't continue, and in the morning he died as well.
So, ironically, Burke did get the fame that he'd been chasing.
Yeah, he wanted the fame of being an explorer, and he became famous. We're talking about him 150 years after he died, but yeah, unfortunately he didn't get the fame quite the way he thought. He wanted to go back to Melbourne as a hero. He got fame by dying.
As we look back from the 21st century, we can see that the tragic expedition wasn't a complete waste of time. It did complete the picture of inland Australia and proved once and for all there was no inland sea.
Most of us have only heard of a handful of Australian explorers, either those who spectacularly succeeded or those who completely failed. But actually there were hundreds of them. Some, like Burke, were hugely funded, but most of them were little handfuls of stockmen who just rode that bit further than anyone else. And the result? They opened the country up to sheep, cattle, and the people who worked with them. And that transformed Australia.
Next time, I'm going to explore how a grab bag of remote colonies finally got their acts together.
For a long time, there wasn't really a place called Australia.
Was federation the realisation of one migrant's lofty dream?
That free passage was a pretty good investment, wasn't it?
Or did fear play a part in the forming of a nation which went on to become a multicultural success story?
What a great country where your destiny is in your own hands.
Next on SBS, discover the decade of Michael Jackson, Madonna, and the rise of MTV in the 80s.